Welcome back to American Lit. I'm Thelma English, and this is session 17. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and the privilege of home education. We lift up all the states here in America and pray that home education would remain legal. And we pray for those who fight for us so vigorously to keep home education legal. We thank you for each family represented here and for each young man or young woman, each student represented here. In Jesus' name, amen. Again, welcome back. We have a fun session this week. I hope you have been enjoying your reading. Let's pause now for your Valley of Vision devotion. Okay, we're back. Again, if you are trying to run this course as a classroom, whether it's in your living room or in a private school setting, be sure to reach out to me and contact me so that you can get the devotion suggestions, the booklets, the quizzes, the exams, the answers for exams, the daily handouts and all the weekly handouts and all of that. My email is not printed on the PowerPoint, so you have to write it down. It is Thelma, THELMA .lito, LITO, @gmail.com. I don't print it on a slide because I don't want the bots going through and get inundated with lots of junk email. But if you are taking this class for real, if you are not just listening to the lectures, that you're taking it for real as a class, if a parent or teacher contacts me, I will send you 31 or 32 emails with everything that you need for each of the 31 or 32 weeks, so that you will have the quizzes and the quiz answers and all of that to run a class. And of course, everything is free. I'm specifically designed for homeschoolers, of course, and for Christian homeschoolers. If you are not a Christian, I suppose you will be offended. All right, session 17, schedule review. We are turning in our Emerson, Thoreau, or Douglas biography, our mini biography, and we're starting Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a 5-week project, a 5-week project. And this week you're reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, chapters 1 through 9. And you must read the real edition, not anything abridged or adapted. You must read the actual book by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And you're reading the first 9 chapters. Next week, we'll have a quiz on chapters 1 through 9. And your assignment, which is due in 5 weeks on session 22, is your choice of either a character analysis or character study, or a theme analysis, or theme study, or plot study. You need to include quotes. So grades 7 and 8, you have 175 words for a character study. Grades 9 and 10, 225 words. Grades 11 and 12, 250 words. These are papers that fit on one piece of paper. We do write lots of papers, but they are all very short. And that does seem to be the way of the world now. Lots of papers, but short. So you need to be precise and concise. We're not looking for lots of fluffy stuff. In fact, your teacher or parent may very well take a black pen and cross off all of the fluffy, unimportant things to help you to write precisely. Get as many facts as you can into this short paper. Go ahead, feel free to make conclusions, but make sure they are based on facts. A character analysis or a character plot study, you pick one character. For example, you could pick Uncle Tom or Chloe, or you could pick one of the other characters, Marie St. Clair, and you could examine their purpose. Why did Stowe place that character in the book? How does that character move the plot? And you do have handouts for writing plot studies, theme analysis, character studies in your syllabus. Those are in your syllabus pages, and you've had those as handouts previous weeks. A theme analysis. Why did Stowe write this book? What is her purpose? What is her theme in writing this book? And obviously her theme has something to do with slavery is evil, it is morally wrong. It is because slavery was legal at the time she's writing this, 1851. Slavery ruins not only just the slaves and the families of the slaves. It's not only morally wrong, it also even ruins the slave owners. They are lesser, worse people. The people themselves become cruel and wicked and unnormal, unnatural. A plot study is a much harder paper to write. You might end up with 800 actual words writing a plot study because you would have to include the minor plots. And so you could give 2 or 3 sentences on each of the major plots in the book. There are multiple layers of plots. There are different, there's Eliza and Harry, Eliza and her husband and son. There is Legree and his slaves. There is Uncle Tom and his travels and Chloe. There are lots of different plots all woven beautifully together in this. Do include quotes. I would suggest grades 7 and 8 need to have 1 or 2 quotes. Grades 9 and 10 need to have 2 or 3 quotes. And grades 11 and 12, I would expect 3 or 4 quotes, even in a short paper, so that you, even if they are quoted sections, you can pick up adjectives right from Stowe as she describes Uncle Tom and include those in your paper for backup, for proof. Next week, we will be continuing Uncle Tom's Cabin, and we'll start about Romanticism and realism. Realism is just another branch of Romanticism, another flavor. We'll have our quiz. We'll start some new structured notes, and we'll be reading chapters 10 to 18 in case you're reading ahead. And you should be getting ideas for your paper. Do session 22. Please don't wait until session 21 to start writing that paper. So mark things up in your book, get some ideas, write ideas down, mark, or if you're not supposed to mark in your book, then use sticky notes to mark where the pages are, where you found awesome quotes, or light pencil marks that can be erased later. All right, it's time for our Frederick Douglass quiz on the last half of his narrative. I know you enjoyed that. Let's pause the video for that quiz. All right, we're back. That was an easy quiz. You only had a few more questions. And I realize it's kind of a lame quiz as far as quizzes go. If you write a better quiz, you can send it to me. In the news, in January 2017, a bedtime story that Mark Twain told to his daughters in 1879, which was never published before, was released 6 years ago as a children's book. Now it's, this 6 years ago. I think it was released in 2011, so I should have updated that slide, so it's more than 6 years. You have the news article for this, that's in the American Lit Session 17 materials at the website, or if I have sent you 31 or 32 emails, then it would be in the email that has a subject line of Session 17. It's a cool handout about this book, which is kind of a new book, more than 100 years after he wrote it, The Purloining of Prince Oleomargarine. So we know this is going to be kind of funny. And this particular one that I did a screenshot of the book cover is quite clever. It looks like it's a funny book. I still haven't bought this book. My intent is to buy this book and enjoy it. However, I'm making these videos now, and so I still am not actually retired, and I still don't have time to get that book and read it. It would have to be for another day. American poets. I like to highlight a poet every week. I don't always remember. I'd like to highlight this week American poet Lucy Terry Prince. She lived from 1730 to somewhere at 1821 or later. I've read several articles about Prince, and I don't know that they know exactly the year that she died. She did live to be in her 90s, possibly late 90s. The first recorded poem by a Black person was Lucy's poem called Bar's Fight. Now, it's not a fight in a bar, like a saloon fight. Bars is the name of a location, the Bar's Fight. And it's actually a story of Native American Indians attacking a settlement. And she ended up writing this poem about it. First, it was orally recorded, and then it was written down later. It's a ballad about 2 neighboring families who were massacred by Indians in Deerfield, Massachusetts, at a place they called the Bar. She was 16 years old and she was an eyewitness of this massacre. This is not something you would ever forget. Her poem was recited orally until 1855 when it was pinned to paper. Lucy was not just a poet. She was one of those remarkable women with a pioneer spirit and intelligence to match. Many of us, if we had seen such a massacre, might end up in an institution and never able to communicate with people again. We would call that PTSD, that she could have suffered, and she may have suffered greatly from PTSD, although we don't see that. She was a remarkable woman with a pioneer spirit. She really was one of those early pioneer women with the intelligence to match, what you need to be a pioneer woman. She was stolen from Africa as an infant. She was sold to Ebenezer Wells of Deerfield, and at the age of 20, she got saved during the Great Awakening. That would be Jonathan Edward and anyone who was out preaching with him under that first Great Awakening, which is pretty cool. At age 26, she married a prosperous, free Black man. His name was Abijah Prince, who had to purchase her freedom to marry her. Now imagine that. She's probably worth, I don't know, $1,500, $2,000 for a slave. Even then, it's almost 300 years ago, 250 years ago. I don't know if my husband would buy me if he had to pay $50,000 for me. Would he have bought me and married me? But her husband had to purchase her freedom and then married her. They ended up with 9 children and they moved to Vermont. Lucy was known for her eloquent speech. When a neighbor threatened her family, Lucy fought her own court case and she won. Okay, girls, this is where we just feel so good. Not only did she start out as a slave, not only was she a woman, and she was Black, she was a minority, and she had witnessed a massacre. But when she had a problem with the law, she took her case to court and she won it. When a neighbor tried to steal land from her family, she argued the case all the way to the Supreme Court and won. And the Supreme Court judge who was officiating in charge said that she presented her case more eloquently than he had heard any, I think it was Virginia, lawyer. She spoke and presented her case better than any lawyer he had heard yet. This is an awesome lady. She wrote many poems, but only this one survives. This is a long time ago. Poems are written down on little pieces of paper, and unless you're actually published, then it's pretty tough. Lucy died in 1821, possibly later at the age somewhere. She lived to be late 97. I read one article that believes she lived to be 110. That is one tough lady. As to what happened when Black Christians were admitted to church fellowship, we don't really know. This is the Wells house, which these is one of the families that had purchased her. We know that Black slaves in New England, they had personal accounts in stores, they held land, they served in wars, and yet if they were slaves, they could still be sold right along with livestock. That must have been terribly intimidating to think that you could earn money, you could be a slave, you could go earn money with a job, you could hold land, you could go fight in a war for your country, all of those things. And yet if you were a slave and your master died, you could just be sold along with all the animals. Lucy aged. She got older. She lived into her 90s at least. Her husband, Abijah, died in 1794, and she returned yearly to his grave on horseback, because there are no cars yet. Look at the dates here. A 90-mile trip that she rode on horseback well into her 90s. She visited his grave every year. That's devotion. Imagine your devotion to a husband who not only loved you and cared for you, but had to buy you. That's devotion. She was a contemporary of Phyllis Wheatley. If you look at the dates here, they were living at the same time. This is the poem, Bar's Fight. August 'twas the 25th, 1746. The Indians did in ambush lay some very valiant men to slay. 'Twas nigh unto Sam Dickinson's mill. The Indians there 5 men did kill, the names of whom I'll not leave out. Samuel Allen like a hero fought, and though he was so brave and bold, his face no more shall we behold. Eleazar Hawks was killed outright before he had time to fight. Before he did, the Indian Sea was shot and killed immediately. Oliver Amsden, he was slain, which caused his friends much grief, pain. Simeon Amsden they found dead, not many rods from Oliver's head. Adonijah Gile, we do hear, did lose his life, which was so dear. John Sadler fled across the water, and thus escaped the dreadful slaughter. Eunice Allen see the Indians coming, and hoped to save herself by running, and had not her petticoats stopped her, the awful creatures had not cotched her, not tommyhawked her on the head, and left her on the ground for dead. Young Samuel Allen, oh lack-a-day, was taken and carried to Canada. The end of her poem. Can you imagine? Young Eunice Allen saw them coming and could have got away if she didn't have to deal with those blasted petticoats. Imagine fighting Indians wearing petticoats. This is quite a poem. So you can imagine it does appear to be written by a 16-year-old. It's still a really cool poem. And of course, there's no fixed spelling, so don't expect these are not errors. This is just the way the poem is written. There's a very important book in my library. It's called God and the American Writer. And as I was writing my American Lit curriculum, this book was extremely valuable to me. And it's by Alfred Kazin. If you are going to write curriculum and you're a Christian, I would suggest that you research this book. God and the American Writer, they're probably available, used, old, for very little money. Sometimes the best books, the most expensive thing about them is the shipping, the postage. God and the American Writer, from chapter 3, which is titled Christians and Their Slaves. And in this chapter, he's talking about Harriet Beecher Stowe and others. So I'm quoting him directly. Thomas Jefferson's earliest memory was of being carried on a silk pillow by a slave. On the death of his father-in-law, John Wales, in 1773, Jefferson inherited 11,000 acres of land and 135 slaves. He sold half of the land and eventually liberated only 2 of his slaves, one of whom bought his own freedom, went and worked and bought himself. Slave labor worked Jefferson's estate. Under his direction, built magnificent Monticello, that you see here in Virginia, and Jefferson's exquisite summer retreat at Poplar Forest. Slave labor staffed his household wherever he lived. Slave labor eventually built the coffin in which he was buried. Jefferson published one book in his lifetime called Notes on the State of Virginia, which was written in response to queries put to him by a French diplomat in Washington. Having lived all his life as master of a slave society, Jefferson, who said he disapproved of slavery, made it clear in his response to query number 14 that he thought little of the blacks as a race. And this is where we start to be disappointed, especially if you have Black people in your family, as I do. It starts to get really offensive. But this is part of our American history. This is part of our heritage. Should we erase Jefferson from history? No, we can't forget that he lived because of all of his, even our founding documents, we have to credit Jefferson. We must thank him for that. But his approval of slavery and owning slaves, even if by inheritance, we all know he could have freed them. I suppose he would have gone broke and become poor. There are all types of things that you have to address, but keeping slaves, you can't erase. You can't erase that from history. We have to read it. Every generation has to read it, has to know that he was very eloquent in words and that he is a founding father, but we have to remember he did own slaves. Jefferson wrote, "To our reproach, it must be said that though for a century and a half we have had under our eyes the races of Black and of red men, they have never yet been viewed by us as subjects of natural history. I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only that the Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in endowments, both of body and mind." All right, here we see that this would be, you can't call this anything but racist or discriminatory, that he sees the position of the Black people that he owns. And of course, they're not given educations. They're not given enough free time to invent or educate themselves or anything. You need free time. If all you do is work and barely survive, you can't advance yourself. And then if you divide families continually, you can't pass on heritage. It's a terrible circumstance to be in, to be a slave 250 years ago. But what it looked like from the outside, to even Thomas Jefferson, a bright, bright mind, that possibly their distinct race may be not as far along. And you can see this is Darwin thought before Darwin. Jefferson further comments, there is an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. This is interesting that he notes this and yet then thinks that perhaps they are lesser evolved. Stowe definitely pounces on this. This would be one of the major themes in her book, that slavery not only ruins the people who have to be enslaved, but it also ruins the people who are the slave owners. It's an unhappy influence, he calls it. But people who own slaves are worse people because they own human beings. Chasm states, no abolitionist before the Civil War condemned slavery as fiercely as Jefferson did in 1781. But unlike the abolitionist, Jefferson was more concerned with the degradation of his fellow slave owners and saw no stop to it. So he didn't think slavery could be stopped. And he was more worried about the detrimental effect on the white people than on the slaves themselves. Chasm continued, the master's children picked up his worst habits and tyrannized over the smaller slaves. One half of the citizens were given absolute rights to trample on the other half. With the morals of the people went the destruction of their industry. In a warm climate, no man will labor for himself who can make another man labor for him. Very few slave owners are ever seen to labor themselves. So here Thomas Jefferson himself recognizes if a master is out there yelling at his slaves, treating them inhumanly, then what will his child be like? He'll be worse. And the little slave children, he'll be worse to them. And some of those slave children are probably also the master's children. And if it's obviously that a young slave looks like his father, who is his master, then he's going to be in a particularly horrible spot. Jefferson the deist finally broke through his principles to cry, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath? You know, we're making God angry. So at least by, what was the year? 1781, at least by 1781. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. That considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune and exchange of situation is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference. So what is he saying about slavery now? Here, Thomas Jefferson is saying they should have liberty. It's a gift from God. Aren't we making God angry? And he's trembling for his country when he thinks God is a just God and his justice won't sleep forever. Eventually, he's going to rescue those people. Just like he rescued the Hebrews out of Egypt after 400 years, he's going to rescue these people from America. And he says even an exchange of situation is among possible events. Eventually, in the South, there are so many slaves that if they could communicate together with an uprising, they could take over. That might even become possible by supernatural interference. God might even do that for him. So he sees slavery and the raw pain and suffering and damage that it is doing to America. Jefferson at the last thought a better spirit was coming in with the American Revolution. The spirit of the master is abating and that of the slave rising from the dust. His condition mollifying, the way I hope preparing under the auspices of heaven for a total emancipation. So he hopes that these slaves will eventually be emancipated, but interesting that he didn't just free all of his slaves, isn't it? Excuse me. I was just at the doctor yesterday and they're looking at my throat, but I don't think there's anything to be done. I think you have to put up with me. Jefferson at the last thought a better spirit was coming with the American Revolution. We read that. So he'd seen a total emancipation. Needless to say, Jefferson hoped this would happen with the consent of the masters rather than by their extirpation. So he hopes that the masters will all decide, I don't think we should have slaves anymore. Let's free them and pay them a living wage. He hopes they won't have to be ripped out, as in war, or being overturned, everything overturned, so that the blacks are ruling over the whites. But I would say this is rather a weak argument and a weak hope to hope that, because of course, we, especially from a 2022, 2023 perspective, we want somebody to do something. We want him to stand up. If he wants our respect, we want him to have stood up and said, no more slaves. That's what we wanted him to say. As president, Jefferson in 1806 rejoiced that under Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, the importation of slaves from abroad would be prohibited after 1808. In 1808, you couldn't bring in any more slaves. Oh my goodness, what are you going to do? Slaves have babies, but how are you going to get slaves? In his 6th annual message, the president's annual address, he wrote, I congratulate you, fellow citizens, on the approach of the period at which you may interpose your authority constitutionally to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa. So he says, in only 2 years, the Constitution will force you to not import any more slaves, and we can be better people. Various literary accounts were made of the intricacies of slavery and the slave trade. One, Eric Homburger, recalls asking an overseer how he felt about punishing slaves and receiving the casual reply, it's my business, and I think nothing of it. Why, sir, I wouldn't mind killing a blankety blank more than I would a dog. All right, imagine that. This person who punishes slaves, this is his job. Masters bring the slaves, he ties them to the post. They get 5 lashes, they get 20, they get 30 lashes, whatever their punishment is. This is just what he does all day. He ignores the cries, the petition, he ignores everything. And that's his job. And he says, doesn't bother me any more than killing a dog. I don't mind if they die. It's like killing a dog. Look what slavery at this time period did to the humanity of people. Now, let's think about comparing slavery and abortion. How are slavery and abortion alike? What do you think? Slavery and abortion, how are they alike? Okay, keep that in your mind as we progress today. William Lloyd Garrison, who founded The Liberator, that anti-slavery newspaper, you have a sample of that in your syllabus, in 1831, determined it was easier to convince New England than the South. Okay, it's easier to convince New England, and especially Northerners, that slavery is bad than to go down South and have them agree with you about anything. Garrison demanded immediate emancipation. On July 4, 1854, he alarmed many supporters by publicly burning the Constitution, explaining, so perish all compromises with tyranny. So he's calling slavery tyranny. He's standing up. This is what we'd like our heroes to do. He stands up, he burns the Constitution and says, may you all perish like this who compromise with tyranny. He wants it to stop. He knows it's evil. Kazin tells us even Leo Tolstoy was impressed with Garrison's pacifism and effectiveness, because it is hard to be pacifist, to be a pacifist, to be peaceful, and yet to be effective, but it can be done. Martin Luther King taught us this also. You can be peaceful and you can get things done. Garrison understood what the most advanced of the other fighters against slavery did not understand, that the only irrefutable argument against slavery is a denial of any man's right over the liberty of another under any conditions whatsoever. Although Thoreau practiced defiance towards slavery, remember he refused to pay that poll tax, Emerson expressed apathy. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, that plays right into the book we're reading, Uncle Tom's Cabin. You'll hear about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a compromise which mandated that the capture of fugitives, and particularly outraged anti-slavery opinion. Even Emerson, whose disapproval of slavery was usually cool and theoretical, was infuriated enough to write in his journal, "This filthy enactment was made in the 19th, that's the 1800s, by people who can read and write. I will not obey it, by God." So if he comes upon a slave who's escaped, he's not going to turn him in. He'll go to jail for helping them. But he didn't actively go out and help on the Underground Railroad or anything. That was his thought. He is very much theory. Kazan declares Nathaniel Hawthorne was indifferent to slavery. Hawthorne was to say on the outbreak of the Civil War that he had never really believed the South was truly part of the Union, and that he was not unhappy to see it secede, because the South is going to secede from the rest of America. And Hawthorne says, I didn't really think of them as Americans anyway. So he is content to just let the South be the South and let the North be everybody else. And this gets really tricky. This is where you really need to ask your mom and dad, your grandma and grandpa, if they're still alive, a great grandma and grandpa, if you are so blessed, ask them about your family history. Part of my family came over in the 1640s, but part of my family, my father's side, didn't come over until the 1940s, I think. But if you have family that's been here long enough, find out what happened with your family during the Civil War, 1861 to 65. Most people still remember. Most grandmas and grandpas still know what happened with their family. Most people are quite embarrassed if their families fought for the South, and most people are quite proud if they fought on the side of the North. And find out what your family experience was. I know that my grandmother told me long, long ago, probably 50 years ago, that part of the family went and fought for the South, and everyone else fought for the North. And some of them were West enough they didn't fight at all. But that those parts of the family that went North and South never spoke again, never saw one another again. The family was severed. And I would guess that you have some stories like that. It was a cause for which families were completely divided. And the event was so huge on the world stage that you chose a side and you were there. You were just stuck there. Hawthorne wrote, when all its uses shall have been fulfilled, it will vanish like a dream. In the light of history, Hawthorne, descended from Puritans, appears insensitive and shallow. Not believing in divine providence, he was a pessimist and a fatalist. So he kind of thought, well, all these bad things happen and one day it won't be here anymore. But Hawthorne writes, I sympathize with nobody and approve of nothing. I think we have a lot of people living today with that same attitude. And now we come to Harriet Beecher Stowe. She said that the book first came to her as she was sitting in church in a vision of Uncle Tom's character. This was also her protest against the church, which in the North and South failed to condemn slavery as Christians should. So that should have been the Sunday sermon, right? The Sunday sermon in the North should have been getting people together to go down in the middle of the night and rescue slaves. And in the South, they should have been condemning slavery. And so churches that did not, many churches did, but churches that did not, Stowe was condemning. So she's in church and she has this kind of a vision. In her concluding remarks to the novel, it was that kind of a novel, she compared the courage of so many Blacks in undertaking lives of their own upon the failure of the church to support them. If this persecuted race, with every discouragement and disadvantage, have done thus much, how much more they might do if the Christian church would act towards them in the spirit of her Lord. Look at what they're doing, escaping themselves. If the church would help them, imagine how much more they could do. When Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1851, Harriet rose to fame. Her novel highlighted the evils of slavery for her generation and beyond. She inspired other authors and she infuriated the entire South. Stowe was the seventh child of a minister. Despite her mother's death when she was 5, Stowe became one of many famous Beecher children. I would have liked to meet Mr. Beecher, her dad, to raise these kids, especially by himself and then later with a second wife. What an amazing man to raise kids who all became ministers. And then even his daughters were starting colleges and schools and helping slaves escape and writing books that are never forgotten. What a family. What a heritage. Stowe's older sister, Catherine, began a seminary for women. You know, I went to seminary and I did exegetical theology and I loved it. I was in many of my classes, I was the only girl. I wasn't a girl, I was 20 years older than everybody else. But it's amazing. Her sister, Catherine, began a seminary for women. By 1824, Harriet was in seminary. Now, don't you like her even more? She later became a teacher at that same seminary. The father and Catherine moved to Ohio in 1832, and Stowe moved with them. There, she met reformers and abolitionists, all providing fodder for her writing. She wrote a book about geography and she wrote countless articles. Uncle Tom's Cabin isn't just what she wrote. This is on a modern bridge between Kentucky and Ohio. The Ohio River runs in between, and this Ohio River and Ohio and Kentucky play a great part in the very first part of Stowe's novel, the part that you're reading this week. If you're in Kentucky, a slave state, if you can get across the river to Ohio, which is a free state, you can be free. And then you can stay, you can keep going north or get to Canada that didn't have slavery, or help free other slaves, come back and free other slaves, whatever. But this plays a big part in Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I think it's kind of cool that the line is marked in the middle of the river here. And the river, of course, in Kentucky and Ohio, in hard winters, the river freezes over. And that's also going to play a part in the book that you're reading this week. So these are cool ladies. If you're a young woman taking this class, don't you just love cool American historical ladies? So she wrote all of these books. She's famous. Stowe met Calvin Stowe, and here's where we have our little romantic Disney moment, a professor at Lane Seminary, and they married in 1836. Her husband encouraged her writing. In her lifetime, she wrote 30 books and several novels. Only Uncle Tom's Cabin is remembered and read as a classic. I don't even know all the titles of her other books and articles. Her inspiration for Uncle Tom's Cabin came from after the death of her 18-month-old son, Charlie, in 1849 of cholera. This tragedy helped her to write about the plight of Eliza. You'll be reading about that this week, who runs away to save her son from being sold. And yes, this is an actual picture of her little son, Charlie. I know we don't take pictures of dead children anymore, so I'm sorry if this offends any of you, but parents who could get anybody to come in with a camera would often, if they had the money, if they could do it, they would have somebody come in and take a picture immediately after death, so they had something to remember that child by. You wait till the last minute hoping they're going to survive, but if they die, you get that picture just to remember them by, so that you at least have that photo. In the old days too, you can see he's got a little flower in his grasp. You might have a favorite toy beside him, a favorite toy animal or doll, and you might then, if it was a girl with any amount of hair, mothers and grandmas would often clip locks of their hair. We'll see that in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin also. When a female is dying, she's got curls and she clips off and gives everybody she loves a curl, because she knows that she may die, and they can tie that up in a little ribbon and press it in their Bible and save it. They won't have a photograph, but they will have that little lock. I have a family book of poetry that is more than 100 years old, and it has a lock of hair, and it has a little piece of pink silk that was a dress someone was buried in, and someone clipped off a little piece of that silk and a lock of hair and put them in the back of a book of poetry. And that's how you remembered someone. Now you have thousands of photos of your little brother if he passed away. But if you lived during the time of Harriet Beecher Stowe, you might only have this one picture. And when her son died and cholera, he probably coughed to death. It would have been just a horrible, horrible way to die. We still see cholera in what we call third world. We used to say third world countries. Now I believe the politically correct term is undeveloped nations, and we'll still see cholera break out. And it's usually from animal, human feces, accidentally ingested, things like that. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850. This law required non-slave owners in free states like Ohio to return slaves to their masters or be prosecuted. Now, in 1850, $1,000 is a lot of money. I can't even imagine how much that would be now. It's more than 10. That's got to be close to $100,000. It would be a horrible prosecution or 6 months in jail. Uncle Tom's Cabin was originally a serial story published in short sections in the National Era. Her deep Christian faith echoes through the pages. Her empathy for all slaves, especially mothers, is a testimony to her convictions against slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act. This is a cool poster. Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all, you are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. Can you imagine that? For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers, and they've already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of the fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, as so many hounds on the track of the most unfortunate of your race. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open. Isn't that a cool poster? Wouldn't you want to be the person who put that together and put it up? Okay, anybody here who's Black, I want you to stay away from the police. Stay low. Anyway, it's a cool poster. Uncle Tom's Cabin. The scene depicted here you'll be reading about this week, but I won't tell it all to you. Uncle Tom's Cabin was released as a book in 1852, selling 300,000 copies in the first year, 1.5 million copies in Britain. This is a lot of copies. This would be a lot of copies today. It's a lot of copies. The stories, especially the story of young Eliza, you'll read that this week, was performed on stage and translated into dozens of languages. In fact, it was performed on stage. It was on stage somewhere in the United States for the next 80 years, just this section of the book. When her account of slavery was ridiculed and challenged, she published another book called Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was filled with her primary sources. Southern writers tried to write novels that portrayed slavery as benevolent. So people wrote books against her. People tried to say slavery was a benevolent association, that these people cannot care for themselves. They're not as far along on the evolutionary scale, and so they need to be watched over, kind of like animals. They need to be herded and fed and taken care of, that we're doing them a favor. There were all types of things that the South tried to do. Think of when you were a child, all of the stupid things excuses you try to give your mother for why you did some bad thing. My son, or one of my sons, fell down the stairs one time because his socks were slipping way past his toes and he tripped on them. And they got to the bottom of the stairs. And he looked at me, and he's about 3 years old, and he says, "This is your fault, Mom." He says, "You didn't tell me to pull my socks up." That's the way these slaveholders are. They have all of these excuses, and they wrote their own books trying to be convincing, but hers was the book that changed the world. The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, I used to own that. It's kind of boring because it's just primary resources, but it was really cool because she had to wait a while to publish that because she couldn't tell who the real people were, where the real places were, or she would be giving them away and ruin the Underground Railroad. It had to happen after slavery was illegal, and then she could publish all the real facts. And I ended up giving that away to a former student who was going to use it for teaching purpose. So I no longer have a copy. It's getting rare too. If you want a copy, you better look it up on some of the used book sites now. Abe Books, ABE books.com is a good bookseller that I use for used books sometimes. Stowe used her fame and her income to help end slavery. She traveled the nation and abroad to appeal for support against slavery. In 1873, now this is after the Civil War, 61 to 65, Harriet moved to Hartford, Connecticut, but she summered in Florida. So they had enough money, they could have a Florida home, and we would almost call that snowbirds, but except you usually go in the winter. This is a picture of her home. We know that Stowe asked her friends to share their stories of slavery with her. So she was getting to write this book. She was inspired. She had this kind of a vision while she's sitting in church. And then she wrote to all her friends and said, please, I need your stories of escaped slaves, your stories of slavery. I need all of that for fuel. And people gave her all their fuel. I like this quote. I feel now that the time has come when even a woman or a child who can speak a word for freedom and humanity is bound to speak. I hope every woman who can write will not be silent. She immersed herself in abolitionist literature. Her recent tragic loss of young Charlie and the earlier loss of her mother at her age 5 made her especially suited to write this story. She knew what it was like to not have your mother, to have your child die. She felt that it made her empathetic toward slaves. Her Christianity could not approve of any part of slavery. Her family had employed Black women, so she knew firsthand that color was only skin deep. So they had Black employees, and she knew Black people were just people. Stowe allows the reader to vicariously experience slave culture and experience. And that's why we read Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's not just facts and figures. It's not maps. It's not a textbook where somebody else reads all the primary resources and then spits it out into a few paragraphs to try to give you a summary, because those contain opinions. When you read primary resources, we're reading the authors themselves who lived in that time. And then we can vicariously experience that history. It's a matter of taking the side of the weak against the strong, something the best people have always done. Her assessment of slavery is from a theist's perspective. She begins on a Kentucky farm, remember that's a slave state, and works her plot down into the deep South to avoid shocking the reader too much from the beginning. If she had begun her story in Louisiana, the reader might close the book after the first 9 chapters. They just might not want to read the rest. It might be too hard. But she starts out in Kentucky. Remember, Kentucky is just across the river from Ohio. And so Kentucky slavery was nicer. It's not on a plantation where you work people to death. It's on a farm. The 2 characters, Mr. Shelby and Mr. Haley, who you will meet immediately, provide contrasting models. A pretty good man and an evil man. And this builds suspense. So here we are in Kentucky. The story begins in Kentucky. We have Mr. Shelby. He has a farm. He's got a wife. He has a ranch hand, Tom, who is called Uncle Tom by everyone on the ranch. And he's got this farm, or on this farm. And Uncle Tom is basically in charge of it. Uncle Tom makes him his money. However, Uncle Tom has a wife and children and relatives. They have church on Sunday. They're like a big family. They have to live in squalor compared with the white people living in the big house. But Mrs. Shelby has even brought in a young Black woman who is like a daughter to her, who she cares for. And they've allowed this young woman, she dresses like a white lady. She acts like a white lady. She goes to church. She got married like a white lady. She has a baby like a white lady. Her husband works on a neighboring farm. They don't get to live together because they're slaves, but she's got her little baby there. And Mrs. Shelby thinks of him almost like a grandchild. But Mr. Shelby is not very good with money. And what's going to happen to his farm if he's not very good with money? And in comes Mr. Haley. Mr. Haley's evil. He's a slave trader. And you're going to meet both of these men this week. And Stowe, this is what writers do. If you are a good writer, if you want to be a good writer, this is what good writers do. They make their case. We meet Mr. Shelby, we think everything's going to be okay. And then we meet Mr. Haley, and we realize, like the entire South did when this came out in 1852, that something wicked this way comes, to quote Macbeth in Shakespeare. I like this poem. This is about Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I think this speaks to us as students of Stowe. She told the story, and the whole world wept at wrongs and cruelties it had not known, but for this fearless woman's voice alone. She spoke to consciences that long had slept. Her message, freedom's clear revel swept. From heedless hovel to complacent throne, command and prophecy were in the tone, and from its sheath and sword of justice leapt. Around two peoples swelled a fiery wave. But both came forth transfigured from the flame. Blessed be the hand that dared to be strong to save, and blessed be she who in our weakness came. Prophet and priestess, at one stroke she gave a race to freedom and herself to fame. By Paul Laurence Dunbar. I just like that poem. And to Harriet Beecher Stowe, what did she say? I thought no more of style or literary excellence than the mother who rushes into the street and cries, help, to save her children from a burning house, thinks of the teaching of the rhetorician or the elocutionist. So Harriet Beecher Stowe says, I wasn't thinking about writing a wonderful book that'd be a bestseller and make me famous and make me a lot of money. I was like one of those mothers when the house is on fire and your kids are in there and you're running in saying, help, help, help. So she wrote that book calling on us as the readers. But in 1852, help, help, help. Isn't that amazing? The Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. And this is inside the Harriet Beecher Stowe house. I found this at a blog spot, which was pretty cool. When a vlogger, I guess they call them, no, it's a blogger. It was not a vlog. It's not video. It was a blogger. This blogger has visited the Harriet Beecher Stowe house and put up photos of it. And I copied these photos and gave her the credit. Sometimes I go to Flickr because you can find photos on Flickr. This was just the quickest that I found photos. But you can also go on Flickr if you are making PowerPoint presentations, and you can find sometimes the photographers. Occasionally when I read an article that I'm really interested in, it says photos by, and it tells who took that photo. I look up that person, that photographer on Flickr, Flickr, it's Flickr without the E, on Flickr, and you can find that same photographer, and maybe they took 25 photos and the magazine only used 2 or 1 or 6, but I can find other photos. I do that for classes all the time. That's just a hint if you're making PowerPoints. So this is kind of a cool old house. This is a group of emancipated slaves in Stowe's home. And I want you to take a look at the children. Take a look at the children. What do you notice? Raise your hand if you notice something significant about these kids. Yeah, what's significant about actually 4 out of 5 of these kids? Would you know that the 2 on the left and the 2 on the right, would you recognize them as slaves? Do they have any trademarks of being part Black? Slavery goes down generation after generation. Now, the 2 on the left, the 2 on the right, if they could escape, they could live free lives because they're white enough. How did they become so white? Yes, part of the terrorism of slavery. And the poor little guy in the middle is Black. So he would be identified easily. And the 3 adults in the back are quite Black. So it'd be very difficult to escape for them. Occasionally people could, the Spaniards are sometimes dark skinned. So if you had the mannerisms, perfect English and grammar and all of that, possibly you could get by as being a Spaniard. Someone's going to do that in Uncle Tom's Cabin. But if your skin is really dark, there's no way out unless you can get north to freedom. But isn't that an amazing picture inside Stowe's home? And there you have 5 little children. Who knows what stories are behind each of those little faces? Each of those children If only we could sit down and hear their little stories. The adults in the back, when you see their hardened faces, I'm not sure we could withstand their stories. But those little kids in the front, wouldn't you like to hear their stories in person? Amazing, isn't it? As Stowe said, it's a matter of taking the side of the weak against the strong, something the best people have always done. All right, now an article from JSTOR. The JSTOR is for, it signifies journal storage. You can use JSTOR for all types of sources. I have the particular URL on my last slide, my sources cited in case you want to look this up, but I am printing the entire article here. The article is called Kidnappers of Color versus the Cause of Anti-Slavery. And this is interesting, and few Americans, in fact, I think a lot of Black Americans may not realize this. And generally, our section on slavery in America is limited to just studying the Civil War. And so we don't get much unless we read some firsthand accounts, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, even though it's a novel, would be firsthand accounts. The place names and the people names have been changed, and the circumstances have all been woven together of various people in various places into one story. But if someone like Frederick Douglass, unless we actually read these primary resources, you can't vicariously experience it. And that's why in American Lit, we read those primary resources. When we studied Puritans, we read what the Puritans wrote. And when we study slavery, we want to read what the slaves wrote and the people who helped slaves escape. Thousands of freeborn Black people in the North were kidnapped into slavery through networks that operated as a form of reverse Underground Railroad. Now let that soak in. These are not escaped slaves. These are freeborn Black people who live in the North. And now you can't get slaves. After 1808, you can't import anymore. So how can you get more slaves? You go up in the North and you kidnap them and drag them down to the South and make them into slaves. So here you have this gentleman in this image, and he is a gentleman. You can tell by his clothing, and he's just being kidnapped. Between the banning of slave importation in 1808 and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, thousands of freeborn Black people in the North were kidnapped into slavery. The illicit gangs that ran this human trafficking often had colored collaborators. So they had Black or Negro collaborators, people who helped them. Such treacherous creatures, in the words of early Black abolitionist David Walker, called for desperate measures. If you have Black people who are traitors who are willing to help, there are people who will do anything for money, right? Scholar Richard Bell writes, and he's the author of our article, writes that the ever-present threat of blackbirders, as these kidnappers were known, regardless of their color or sex, helped forge a binding relationship between African-American identity and the cause of anti-slavery. Free Black residents of northern towns and cities reacted with early and unrestrained energy to stop kidnappers of color in their tracks, continues Bell. Such direct, physically and violent confrontations with agents of the slave power were uncommon at the time and mark an early point of origin for later practical abolition efforts. Yet the attention paid to the well-known rescues and rescue attempts by abolitionists after the Fugitive Slave Act has tended to obscure the broadly comparable number made during the 4 decades before 1850. The 1808 ban on slave importation forced the price of slaves to leap upward. So they cost more now. Combined with a cotton boom, they want more cotton, they need more slaves, a new market for enslaved labor literally invaded the free Black communities of the North. White entrepreneurs like Joseph Johnson and his mixed race associate John Smith grabbed young people, especially men and boys, because they can work more, under 20, off the streets of Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, and elsewhere. The Johnson outfit was arguably the most successful kidnapping gang in American history, posits Bell. Operating in the 1810s and 1820s, remember 1808, they can't import anymore, they have to go kidnap them from the North. The game worked by having Smith or another Black man or woman approach likely targets and offer them work, unloading fruit from a sloop. So from a boat, they come and say, would you like $10, $5 to work today to help us unload this boat? Once on the sloop, the youngsters were taken captive and transported for sale in backcountry Alabama and Mississippi or in New Orleans. And stolen merchandise, which happens to be people who are willing to buy stolen slaves don't care that they're stolen. It's like people today willing to buy stolen merchandise. They really don't care where it came from. They just want it. In June 1825, Smith baited and decoyed no less than a dozen children by these means in the space of just a few days. Returning to Philadelphia that August, Smith was under instructions to stock the sloop, Little John, with as many Black children as he could find. Bell argues, the author of our article, argues that this trafficking can be thought of as an underground railroad in reverse. The end goals were different, obviously, but both systems depended on opportunities, subterfuge, fake identities, hideouts, trusted allies in loose networks, and African Americans in the frontline positions. This is not an African slave house, but this is a Chinese slave rescue house for girls in 1886, so that Chinese girls who have been enslaved can escape and come live here. Because what does a girl do if she escapes? Bell writes that the best way to understand the collaborators is to think of them as con artists. The antebellum age, pre-Civil War, was the golden age of the con, and the oldest trick in the book was to project the illusion of shared identity and common cause. So Black collaborators were a common presence in all manner of scenarios involving abduction and rendition in American slavery. So if they could get Black people to work for them up front, they could do it. These kidnappings haunted African American neighborhoods. Think about it, you can't trust anybody. A constant and existential reminder of the limits of Black freedom in post-revolutionary America. So Black freedom, how much is it worth if you can be kidnapped once you're in the North? Can you go out anywhere at night? Can you go out anywhere alone? With the law rarely concerned, and groups like the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and the New York Manumission Society, not particularly militant, the best and most immediate way to try to thwart kidnappers, both white and Black, was to take matters into their own hands. Communities fought back against traitorous brethren and counterfeit kin by doing what communities do best. Children were cautioned and urged to stay in groups. Strangers were challenged. Neighborhood watch committees were set up, as documented by William Wells Brown, John Russwurm, William Parker, and others on the front line of self-emancipation and abolition. Self-defense was added to the mix. So even teaching young Black men self-defense, somebody tries to kidnap you, how can you get away? Vigilantism against Blackbirders, writes Bell, was punitive, preventative, and performative. The last of these was important because these acts were public demonstrations of how far people would go to protect their own. They were important rituals of identity proclamation, visible signs that members of these preyed upon communities would not abide such betrayals. The threat of the colored Judas made racial solidarity a core principle of Black life and freedom, defended by any means necessary. And that's the end of our JSTOR article. So a Black person who was selling other Black people, you're the Judas of the group. You betrayed your own people. All right, I mentioned last week about this book. I may have had the title wrong, I'm not sure. Guns, Germs, and Steel. This is really a cool book. If you don't want to read the book, National Geographic has a 2-part documentary. It does presuppose evolution, but it fits really well with biblical history. The guy, Jared Diamond, just doesn't know biblical history to realize that what he teaches, that's pretty much what Bible history teaches. The book attempts to explain why some nations seem uncivilized, and if not, today we don't say uncivilized, we say undeveloped, and have not progressed in technology like other nations, without blaming the lack of development on the lack of evolutionary progress. So he looks at people primarily living in Africa and says, why are they still living uncivilized? And he doesn't say they're not as far on the evolutionary scale, which is what Darwin said. He's saying why, and he presents this theory, and it's really a good theory. I think he nailed it. The author presupposes all humans came from the Fertile Crescent. Now, that would be the area of Eden. So the Bible history is going to back that up. But some continents have distinct advantages, none of which are in the control of evolution or even of people, of humans. Think about it. Whether or not you have easy freshwater access, if you don't have water, if you can't just walk down to the river or the stream and get water, you might spend half your day just going for water, just trying to get water, collecting water somehow from evaporation, whatever you have to do for water. Domesticated animals. If you have goats, chickens, sheep, cows, if you have animals that are easily domesticated and will breed, you have meat and protein. You've got eggs if you've got a chicken. But what if you live on a continent where all the animals are wild? You can't get milk from a lion. You can't get eggs from a zebra. You can't, if you have to work all day just to get food, if you have to hunt everything you eat, this makes a difference. This makes a big difference in your civilization or lack of. What about fertile land for growing food? So land that's near water and rich soil, in contrast to a hunting-based survival that requires a nomadic life because you're continually moving with the animals. So you have to live in tents as Bedouins. You can't build villages and stone homes and things like that. Think of the difference. And Jared Diamond presents, this is why people on some continents did not develop society and technology as quickly as other continents, because they just didn't have what it took to get free time and have time to develop. Diamond provides an account of the global rise of civilization that fits nicely with biblical narrative, and he doesn't know it. His thesis rids the world of the need for evolutionary thought. Why are these African people still living in huts, spending all day hunting food? Why haven't they progressed? You don't need evolutionary thought. You don't need Darwin to explain this and say, well, they're still kind of ape-like and they just still have to develop more. You don't need evolution for this. Those who are uncivilized, they're not lesser humans on an evolutionary scale. They just haven't had the advantages of water, fertile land, and easy access to food sources, which in turn leaves time for invention and innovation. If you can build a house out of stone, live there by the river, have water, have food, have chickens and cows and things like that, then you can spend your time inventing things and making things easier and developing, making cement and all of those other things that we do with free time. Okay, so I know we've looked at this the last few weeks. We're going to look at this again, social Darwinism, the consequences of a man as an animal. What are the consequences if man really is an animal? And you can see what science is supposedly all about: experimentation, observation, repeatability, and Darwin basically falls off the cliff here because you have to take quite a leap of faith away from experimentation, observation, and repeatability. In 1859, Darwin had published his famous On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, which offspring have the ability to survive. Nature makes that choice, he says, natural selection. This book is the one which best addresses Darwin's sinister racism. With savages, and I know this is the third time you've seen this quote, get used to it. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. So the weak ones die, and then you eliminate them from the gene pool, and everybody else gets stronger and healthier, and that's the way it's supposed to be, thinks Darwin. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the progress of elimination. We stop that. We stop the weak from dying. We build asylums for the imbecile or crazy people, the maimed and the sick. We build hospitals. Instead of the sick people or the people with bad genes, bad genetic makeup, so that they pass on these diseases, you get rid of them. You let them die, and then you get them out of the gene pool, and you clarify the gene pool is the idea. The Descent of Man, chapter 5, called Civilized Nations, page 501 in my Modern Library edition, we institute poor laws. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. This is one of those crazy ideas where we look at this and say we approach humans as we approach breeding animals. It means some people, you don't want to let them breed. And this is where we have experimentation And this is where we have some of the guys in prison, especially minorities, sterilized against their wishes so that they can't propagate, or criminals, the criminal mind, whatever color they are. Criminal acts were thought to be something that you could inherit from a parent. If your dad was a murderer, you'll be a murderer. And so you would sterilize those people while they're in jail so they couldn't have any children. We have all types of consequences of the descent of man, all types of consequences here. While Darwin's influence on scientific thought was profound, his works also influenced thinking about economics, how you spend money, race, different kinds of people instead of all one people, class, and other areas. Social Darwinism suggested that in society of competitors, those who won, often affluent whites, rich white people, prevailed through superior breeding. Those who failed, poor African American, Chinese, Indian, Irish, and that includes women, did so because of inferior breeding. Darwin's theories are responsible for eugenics, infanticide, abortion, and racial extermination. He's called a genius by most, but those are the people who never actually read Darwin, especially Descent of Man. Just as the naturalist writers had done, social Darwinists wrote, and they tended to focus their arguments on the poor and the infirm, where the struggle of the species and its supposedly less fit examples. So the characters in their books are going to be poor or infirm. That's where it's most evident. Hitler even built his ethics on Darwinian principles. In the final estimation, social Darwinism appears to be a reaction to what was perhaps the most unsettling revelation of Darwinism, the rescinding of humanity's providential purpose. Humans no longer appeared to exist for any particular reason. The earth didn't need us and had probably existed for a long time with us. And here you have a whole bunch of poor children who go down in the mines somewhere in Britain, I believe, and mine all day. They're poor. Social Darwinism used this theological void, this worldview, which has an absence of God, to challenge notions of social charity. Do you really want to take care of these grimy little kids so that they will live and propagate their kind and make more people just like them? Social charity, but also to recast humanity's purpose as willful self-perfection. Now, at the end of the class today, I want you to talk about, what does theological void mean? When a writer is writing in a theological void, what will that mean, and what does that mean to us as Christian readers? And what does willful self-perfection mean? What is the purpose of humanity? Why did God make us? Why are we here? Are we here just for willful self-perfection? Do the best that we can for each other? What are those two things? And I'd like you to talk about those when class is over, if you have time. Social Darwinism denies theology or religion as a motivating force in the world, and instead perceives the universe as a machine. Think about it. We believe that you are not an accident. Even if your mom and dad told you were an accident, you're not. God knew you were going to be born. And you have a purpose here. You have a call. And your job as a Christian, as a young Christian, is to find out what you're good at and what you feel God is calling you to do, and do that. Do something for God. You want to leave the world a better place. But if you remove theology and religion as motivating force and then see the world just as kind of a machine, then you might decide mankind, the only way to get better is to kind of cleanse the gene pool. We call that ethnic cleansing, when you go around killing everybody you don't like. Hitler did that with the Jews. And that's been done with other minority groups also, or prisoners especially. 18th century Enlightenment thinkers had also imagined the world as a machine, but as a perfect one, invented by God and tending toward progress and human betterment. Hitler's secret breeding program, something you probably haven't heard about yet, secret breeding program produced at least 20,000 Lebensborn children, born to create racially pure children for the Third Reich. They were going through men like crazy. They needed to raise up a racially pure generation. Volunteers turned over the children to the Nazis. There were secret birthing facilities, hidden identities, and the theft of hundreds of thousands of children. If you were blonde with blue eyes and looked like a perfect specimen, you might be kidnapped. These children were later ostracized and became social outcasts. Germany has never officially apologized for these kidnappings or anything that went on. So during World War II, this was their attempt to make more of themselves, the pure Germans. And after World War II, all of these kids were ostracized. Nobody wanted to be around them. These are Lebensborn children. They're just living in facilities. They all have all the traits that Hitler wanted to have in children. Descent of Man was Darwin's first book to concentrate on mankind's origins. There's a presupposition that man is an animal. The rest of the theory rests on this presupposition that man is an animal. Applying evolutionary theory to man is where the horrific position of man as an animal rears its ugly head. Because with this premise, all social constructs are brought into question. Medical analysis and treatments for the imperfect. Should you really treat and help somebody live a long life if they're not perfect? Shouldn't you just try to get them out of the gene pool? The economics of government money spent on the infirm. Should the government be spending taxpayer money on the infirm, those who are sick and weak? Educational value on lesser development of the human species of animals. Should you spend education money on these people? Societal responsibility to weaker and lesser evolved humans, females, Blacks, Chinese, Irish, anyone who's a minority. Do we have any responsibility to them, or should they be off in another area sterilized so that they don't keep having little people? In 2009 was the 150th year anniversary of the Descent of Man, so it got a lot of attention and a lot of ink was spilled in 2009. A collection of essays was prepared to say what he got right and what he got wrong. One of the writers addresses good science, an essential lost to time in 2022 or 2023. Science used to demand a theory be presented, and other scientists would either refute or support the theory, and then theories got tested and retested through time. That's the way science used to be. Darwin argued human origins are from Africa. The Bible does not support that. Another writer declares morality appeared in early humans, not related to religion. Where does morality come from? The problems with the above presumptions is that we already have the written record of early humans in the Fertile Crescent. We know where the people, after the destruction at Babylon, we know where they went. We have many place names for nearly identical 6,000 or more years later. We have lots of place names, people names that are almost identical to the names that they hold today. Our roots are very clear. This is one, I'm not sure who prepared this visual, but this is, all right, it looks like Stephen Miller, casualenglishbible.com, prepared this visual for Shem, Ham, and Japheth and where the people went after the flood, which is really a cool visual. And then you go to these other countries and you find that we have names and place names that are very similar to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and then to their children place names. These things are pretty obvious. And my favorite quote that I still, the author is still unknown, the Bible is like a vine with branches spreading across time and continents. The scriptures have provided inspiration for the greatest musicians, we're almost done here, musicians, poets, artists, and scientists. All moral progress of our race is directly from the Bible. It's not from evolution, it's from the Bible. Try to imagine removing the influence of the Bible from art, from architecture, from law books, from scientific laws and scientific theories, from poetry, from music. What would you have left? The Bible is the dividing line between chaos and civilization. All right, reading this week, you're reading the first 9 chapters of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and there's going to be a reading quiz for Uncle Tom's Cabin every week. There will be a quiz. Okay, this is how I'm going to leave you. My last slide, these are my online sources that I utilize in case you want to look into that Hitler's breeding program, or I don't know if you can click on this and use it as a hot link from a video or not, and some of the photos and Descent of Man from that JSTOR article. And JSTOR is a rich resource for articles on any subject you're interested in. But this is what I would like you to look into and talk about after the end of this video in a couple of minutes. Look at the theist, the deist, and the romantic. Think about the theist examining evidence theologically, the deist examining evidence scientifically, and the romantic examining evidence emotionally. And you could talk about marriage or the law, some of the topics that we've looked at from all 3 perspectives. And that is the end of our lesson for today. The Lord bless you. I'll see you next week.